Thank you for coming. Thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for the Spy Museum for putting this great event on, and thanks to Chris Costa, among others, who supported this effort. I knew I was onto an interesting topic after I had submitted the manuscript last year to the CIA, just so they were aware. If they had any comments, I said be happy to take a look at them. I got a call back in late 2018 from someone that I had been working with at CIA Public Affairs. I had gotten comments along the way. We'd actually made some changes, factual changes, that were quite helpful. And this last conversation, the public affairs officer said to me, I think we're all good from our end, but I have one last question. And there was a pause on the other end of the phone, and I went, okay, here it comes. And he said, are you guys making a movie about this? And I said, I'm trying to finish the manuscript first, but that comes next. But I think it gives an indication that there is an incredible story behind what went on in the 1980s. So what I'd like to do is walk you through a case, a really interesting historical case that is, I think as you'll see, has some notable similarities, some differences, but some similarities with what the U.S. is dealing with today, particularly with the Russians. So the way I'm going to organize this a little bit is to talk about what the Reagan administration faced at the beginning of the 1980s, and then how it responded, and then conclude with kind of where we are today a bit, and then we can get into more details in the Q&A segment. So as a reminder, this is the Cold War division of Europe. The red countries here, dark red's the Soviet Union. The lighter red are the Warsaw Pact countries. Poland sits well within the Warsaw Pact. One of the famous Polish historians called Poland God's playground because of the movement of German, Soviet, and other forces that came back and forth. 1945, at Yalta, Churchill, Winston Churchill, FDR, and Stalin essentially agree that Poland would come under Soviet influence. And that's the way the Soviets interpret it. And so from 1945 until the period we're talking about, Poland is a communist state and comes under Soviet sphere of influence. I think what's interesting is a couple of things as we fast forward through the Cold War. By 1980, when Reagan is elected, what the administration finds as it's being briefed by CIA in the late fall of 1980. So this is Stansfield Turner is the outgoing CIA director. And as they're sitting down briefing the transition team, one of the things that comes up very strongly is Soviet or Russian active measures. And what active measures were essentially an offensive information campaign directed primarily against the United States. The U.S. was the main enemy, and active measures were designed to benefit globally Moscow and communism, and then to undermine the U.S. and its allies, including Western European countries more broadly. So headed by the KGB, but going up all the way to through the CPSU, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Active measures included establishing of front groups to funnel money into political parties, not just communist parties, including ones in the United States, but also non-governmental organizations, World Peace Council, the nuclear freeze movement that was supporting a freeze, and I'll show you in a second some examples of that. It involved covert broadcasting of radio and other programs, and information, and in particular a disinformation campaign that the Russians were running, targeted assassinations, particularly against KGB defectors or against individuals that were speaking out against the Soviet Union, former Soviet academics who had reoriented to Western Europe, moved there, or even to the U.S., and were writing about in ways that denigrated the Soviet Union. There were target assassinations, certainly intimidation in many cases. And as the CIA director, the incoming CIA director, Bill Casey, says, most of these active measures aren't new. When you see it in the quote at the bottom, many of them were employed by Lenin and obviously by Stalin early period. But at no time in the century have these techniques been used with more effect or sophistication than by the current Soviet state. Declassified CIA assessments. This was one that was put together for hearings before the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, the U.S. Congress, noted both covert activities on the left side of the screen by the Soviets, forgeries, placement of articles, including putting either KGB operatives or recruiting journalists to write things in Western or other newspapers, the use of front groups, and then on the overt side, the use of propaganda by TASS and other state-run media, diplomatic efforts, economic agreements, military ties, those kinds of activities. So a range of both overt and covert activities designed to support the Soviet Union and communism, and then to undermine the U.S. Examples of this, on the left side of the screen, we see a KGB effort to undermine efforts to reconsider placing new U.S. nuclear missiles in Europe. These, on the surface, look like they were non-governmental organizations supporting a peace movement. Behind the surface, it was KGB money. On the right side of the screen was a disinformation campaign that the KGB funded. I still hear examples of this when I go around and talk to people today. The basic essence of this was putting out information on radio, publications throughout the world, that the AIDS epidemic that was hitting various places, including in Africa, had its roots in U.S. laboratories in places like Fort Detrick, Maryland. None of that was true. But it actually took root in a range of players, of very sophisticated KGB disinformation campaigns. So these are the kinds of things that Reagan faced when he came to office. One of the opportunities in the face of those active measures was what was going on in Poland at the time. So August of 1990, you've seen the left side of the screen, that's a map of the Gdansk shipyard. It was really the hotbed of the labor unions. They were at shipyards. They were in mines across Poland, and the leader was Lech Wałęsa. In August of 1990, they reached an agreement after a major strike in Gdansk to establish independent, self-governing labor unions. So from the outside, this looks like it's the beginning of an opposition movement that quickly, by the end of the year, end of 1980, is about 10 million strong. It's a pretty big, organized movement. Obviously, at the same time, we have Ronald Reagan that wins the election in 1980. And among other things, he appoints as his CIA director Bill Casey. Bill Casey, very involved in OSS activity during World War II, but comes in very committed to anti-Soviet activities and running covert action programs against the Soviets across the globe. In December of 1981, what looked like at that time was a budding opposition movement ends up getting crushed. Now, even before that, this is July of 1981, martial law happens in December. CIA is putting out major assessments. It's a declassified one of very serious concerns about a Soviet invasion of Poland, much like in Czechoslovakia in 1968. The Soviets end up essentially walking to the edge of the abyss and deciding that it would be too problematic to put Red Army forces into Poland, that it was much better off getting the Poles to crack down themselves using Polish forces, ZOMO, SB, and other forces. So by December of 1981, this is Polish leader Jaruzelski declares martial law, essentially cuts off all communication, puts tanks in the streets, and then we have great photographs like this one of Polish tanks in the streets, and Solidarity members are being sort of rounded up, persecuted, and put into camps across Poland. Lech Wałęsa's put into slightly nicer than a camp, but he's also arrested. So Solidarity is in serious trouble by the beginning of 1982. What Reagan does around Christmas time is go on television, and he makes it very clear politically that the President of the United States does not and will not let stand what is happening in Poland, that he sees, and he likens what's going on at this point to what happened at the founding of the United States. We have individuals committed to liberty and freedom, and that he's going to do whatever he can to support that. So over the course of 1982, we get a range of debates within the U.S. government about what to do in Poland. Do we provide weapons? Do we provide overt assistance? And there's a decision in the end to do a couple of things even before we get to the Polish program. One is to rethink U.S. national security strategy. As I mentioned right at the beginning, in 1945, the U.S. under FDR essentially cedes Eastern Europe, including Poland, to the Soviets. Reagan makes a very important decision in some of his national security documents, including NSDD, National Security Decision Directive 32, 54, and ultimately also NSDD 75. They are not going to recognize Eastern Europe as Soviet sphere of influence. They're going to take action directly against Soviets and Soviet influence in areas controlled by the Soviet Union. Obviously, the Soviets have done the same to the U.S. They had put missiles, ended up taking them out, but in Cuba. So Latin America was fair game to the Soviets. Reagan says Eastern Europe is now fair game to us. One of the other things that he does is he decides that offensive information is going to be on level playing field with military efforts, diplomatic efforts, development efforts. So information warfare, to use that term, is going to be an instrument of American foreign policy, essentially on par with all other instruments. And that becomes really important because that takes on Soviet active measures. What the Soviets are doing to the U.S., inside of the U.S. and globally. So one of the things, if we remember, that's going on in Afghanistan at that point, the CIA is involved in, and there have been books like Ghost Wars by a friend of mine, Steve Call, that has written on CIA assistance to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The CIA is providing lethal aid to the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan. So that's the paramilitary side of special activities work. The Afghan side is, or the Polish side is very different. What Solidarity is it's a political movement. It doesn't need weapons. It's not a paramilitary organization. It needs money that it can run an underground, an information campaign to stay active. So what the presidential finding does that authorizes a covert action program, Reagan actually has to approve it, is it provides money, and with that money, non-lethal equipment, no weapons, this is not Afghanistan, to moderate Polish opposition groups, including Solidarity. So what does that mean in practice? It means, at that point, it was Xerox machines, paper, duplicators, ink, poster boards, anything that you need to run a campaign, technical assistance to run a radio program, technical assistance to break into the evening news on television and put up Solidarity Lives signs on television. All these things end up being helpful, but money really is most helpful. I think the objectives were pretty limited in many ways. I don't think anybody that I've talked to at any level of CIA involved in this program expected or certainly had established as a goal to get rid of the government in Poland. It was simply to ease pressure, support an underground movement that had legitimacy, and that was essentially it, and allow them to communicate with the outside world. Relatively limited objectives. Obviously, over time, they became more important. So the way this worked is a couple of challenges. One is, how do you get that kind of assistance into Poland? Again, it's on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And how do you do it in a way that doesn't undermine Solidarity itself? So this is a covert action program. So the decision was made, first of all, the base of operations is not going to be Poland. That's just way too dangerous. Case officers in Poland, even at that time, were heavily monitored. Instead, it's at stations outside of Poland, including Paris, which had a large Polish emigre population. Second, there's a strong decision that this was never going to be a case where you had CIA case officers directly providing money or other assistance to members of Solidarity. What you were going to build is a range of surrogates that were going to do that for you. So individuals that were already running, Poland even at that period had a pretty strong black market. Legal and illegal aid was coming in through maritime ports, including the Baltic Sea up there south of Sweden, and into Gdansk and other Gdynia along Poland's Baltic Sea. It was coming by truck through the tier system from Western Europe into Eastern Europe. So what CIA did very smartly is they recruited and co-opted individuals that were already moving material into Poland and to help the underground. What they didn't have and what they needed was money. So duplicator machines, Xerox machines, paper, ink, that all came through these and other routes from France and Italy and Sweden and other locations, West Germany, usually by ground or by sea into Poland. Interestingly, by the time it got into the hands of an underground shop, like what we see here on the left, this is my photograph of the European Solidarity Center in Gdansk has these makeshift underground printing shops. So by the time it got to one of these printing shops, it had changed hands so many times. The money had gone from an asset, CIA asset, to an individual. That individual had helped a trucker load goods clandestinely onto a truck that made its way and may have changed trucks, and goods moved through Western Europe into Eastern Europe. Then it was offloaded by that truck into another truck that was brought eventually to a site like this. So, I mean, that may have been 8 times it had changed hands. So if somebody, and this happened, somebody was captured on the Polish side, they'd never know where this came from. They'd never be able to connect it in any way, shape, or form to any foreign intelligence organization, including the CIA. So this assistance was used to print newspapers like the one you see up here. It was used to run a radio program, and it was used to keep an active opposition inside of Poland. This was a global campaign. So what we see is CIA stations and other offices inside of Western Europe, but as far away as Mexico City. They were also doing things like organizing demonstrations on key anniversaries. The anniversary of martial law. There might be demonstrations in Mexico City by Polish emigre communities. There might be demonstrations in Paris on the train on the anniversary of Polish independence. Things that would highlight the authoritarian nature of the Jaruzelski regime. So what you began to see is help in a broader opposition movement that would get picked up in radio and would get picked up. There's also this element of the role of the church, of the Catholic Church. The Pope, remember at this point, Pope John Paul II was Polish, very strongly supported Solidarity. While Reagan was not Catholic, very sympathetic, and they both survived assassination attempts, so had a bond with the Pope. Some of his key cabinet officials and others, including Casey himself, was Catholic. So also felt a bond with the church. So at the strategic level, there was a fair amount of communication, in some cases strategic cooperation between the Catholic Church and CIA and the White House more broadly. In terms of the program I'm looking at, much less so. This was a CIA-run program. Not surprisingly, there was cooperation with some allies like the British. Less so with some other Western European governments. But the church did play a very influential role in supporting Solidarity. Priests, incidentally, when they came in from the outside, were generally not checked at the border. So there were cases where CIA officers would smuggle money or other things through priests into Poland, but it was a pretty small percentage. But the church plays a very important role. And note, by the way, that everything that we're talking about here, duplicator machines, Xerox machines, poster boards, demonstrations, this is all political program. This is not a paramilitary program. Nobody's getting shot or killed because of this. So it's a very different kind of program than what we saw with the Afghan one. Not surprisingly, Polish intelligence and the KGB were very concerned about this activity. We know now in declassified KGB and Communist Party of the Soviet Union internal discussions and memos that they were very suspicious of CIA activity and support to Solidarity. They could never prove it, in part because a well-run surrogate covert action program hides the hand of its those organizations that are providing the assistance 4, 5, 6, 7 layers out. But nonetheless, they seized the Poles and KGB seized leaflets, posters, copies of journals. These are the things that went into the underground, and this gives you a sense, the information on the left side, exactly what went into the U.S. money that was pouring in. It's worth noting, by the way, that especially by the end of the 1980s, there was a fair amount of overt assistance coming from the National Endowment for Democracy, overt programs. There was obviously radio broadcasts being beamed in from Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, Radio Liberty into the Soviet Union. There were other organizations that provided assistance to Solidarity, some governments, some trade unions. AFL-CIO was among the most notable that provided some assistance. In what's available in terms of dollar amounts, however, it looks strongly like, and we put together a database along these lines, that CIA assistance was by far the largest, particularly in the early years, 1982, 83, 84, 85, really the first years that martial law happened in Poland and that Solidarity was on the verge of being eliminated. That's where the primary amount of assistance, covert assistance, was important. And by the end of the 80s, then we saw the amount of overt assistance start to overtake it, and that's when you can take down a program like this because there's so much going on the overt side. So a couple of things also worth noting. I certainly don't want, as we get into the end of this, to give an impression that U.S., whether it's CIA or other organizations, that assistance in and of itself caused or even was the only cause of the collapse of communism, or certainly in the collapse of communism in Poland. But it was an important factor, and it was an important factor particularly in the early years. But we're not done with the story, because by the late 80s, we start to get other things going on. Here on the left, we have the initial billboards and posters for the elections in 1989 after the roundtable discussions in Poland. And one of the things that CIA does is it provides limited assistance, essentially to try to level the playing field. Remember, even at this point in 1989, Polish media was state-sponsored, so the state had a monopoly on information. So some assistance to help putting up these poster boards. And the one on the right is interesting, because there was some CIA assistance that went into even this one. This is Gary Cooper. This is High Noon. And there's an interesting story behind this. Gary Cooper, if you go back to the original poster of High Noon, Gary Cooper's holding a 6-shooter. Now, there's a problem if there are U.S. funding that's going to an organization that is at its core peaceful, and you're putting a 6-shooter into that poster. So the lawyers strongly insist that Gary Cooper cannot hold a 6-shooter in this poster. He's holding, as you can see here, a ballot for voting. So with limited assistance, again, to try to slightly rebalance the media here, because of the heavy, the Soviets were supporting the state here, that Solidarity wins the 1989 elections, and then by 1990, Lech Wałęsa becomes the Polish leader. I would urge you, if you get the opportunity, you can do this on YouTube, watch when he visits the U.S. Congress in 1989. It's the end of 1989. The wall is collapsing at this point. He is a revered figure in the U.S. by both Democrats and Republicans. I mean, this is an area that won strong liberal and conservative support. It was a program that was against communism. So sort of red-blooded conservatives supported it. It was also a trade union. So liberal-leaning individuals supported assistance to a foreign trade union. So this had everybody, essentially, in the U.S. supporting assistance to Solidarity. It is a very emotional visit. And you see the Polish-American ties here with Lech Wałęsa's trip to Capitol Hill. There are members of Congress that are weeping as he walks in because 1989 is such an emotional period. The Berlin Wall falls also in 1989, and as I mentioned earlier, Lech Wałęsa is elected president. So we have Reagan signs the memorandum to authorize covert action in 1982. The program really starts in 83. 7 years later, we have that organization on the verge of defeat that wins the presidential election just 7 years later. Obviously, lots of other factors contribute to the fall of communism and to the election of Lech Wałęsa, and certainly on the right side, the Poles deserve the vast majority of credit for everything that happened. But I will say this, if you're in Poland, including in cities like Gdansk, the legacy of the Reagan administration is very significant. In 2007, Reagan is awarded the Order of the White Eagle. It's the highest, it's one of the highest orders that can be awarded to anyone. Rarely awarded outside of Poland anyway. This is, if you've been to the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, that quote, "I know in my heart that man is good, that which is right will always eventually triumph, and that there is purpose," et cetera, et cetera. You can read the quote. That actually matches exactly why he wanted to provide that kind of assistance to the Polish people in their hour of need. And then on the right side's my picture here, right on the Baltic Sea, is a park, Ronald Reagan Park in Gdansk. And it's got a picture, or it's got a statues of both Pope John Paul II and Ronald Reagan. It's quite a nice park. There are kids playing, birds flying in there. But again, these things are testaments to the legacy that America has in that country in the struggles to support freedom and democracy. And so my last comment before opening this up, and I'll leave these slides up here, are that, you know, this is an example, I think, of an effort where there was support, in this case, started out as CIA, and then it became more overt over time, support to a legitimate opposition movement that was pushing for freedom and democracy. Hard to argue, you can do this, but hard to argue that there wasn't a legitimate need, and hard to argue that the call was not received. And again, as we get into issues that we're dealing with today, including with the Russians, this was a case where an American president decided to put together a strategy and then go on the offensive on an information campaign in response to a strong Soviet active measures anti-American campaign going on. So, I mean, it was really a decision by an American president that he was going to elevate information and that he was going to go on the offensive to a state, in this case, both Poland and the Soviet Union, that he assessed was vulnerable. They were trying to limit information to their societies. He opened it up, allowed the printing presses in the underground to start, and allowed essentially with money those printing presses to continue. So that is, in very brief detail, the story of what is called using the CIA cryptonym QR helpful, that the help that was provided to Solidarity and the Polish people in the 1980s. So we have microphones, and I'm happy to go in whatever direction, including how I even came across this, if you want.
I remember all of this like it was yesterday. My question is about your source material. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure.
Whom did you interview? Were they CIA case officers? If so, how did you get access to them? I have so many questions.
Yes, that's a good question. If you look at my biography, many of the books that I've written are in the area of counterterrorism and special operations. When I was in the government, I obviously worked closely with the CIA overseas. So in thinking about another book, including a terrorism book, my publisher, which is W.W. Norton, came back and said, that market's pretty saturated. Let's look at other options. So it turns out there are a couple of places. One of them is Bob Gates' book From the Shadows that has mentioned the Polish program, CIA support to the Polish program. There are a few other places that had made it through CIA's review board, which also talked about it. Not a lot of detail. And then there were some books that came out right at the end of the Cold War and in the early post-Cold War period, including along the Catholic Church, that had started talking about it. So I went from those initial secondary sources, and then I took a couple of long trips to the Reagan Library in Simi Valley and started to dig through what had been publicly released. And I was able to find, wow, there's a lot more that I had anticipated. That if you're thinking about this as taking a bunch of puzzle pieces and dropping them onto the table, I had enough pieces that you could sort of see the outlines of a story. So the more and then I went to the CIA's CREST database, which is mostly online, but it's in Maryland. Declassified information, a lot also on CIA assessments of the Polish situation, and a few things that were directly helpful for this. Then I went to Poland and talked to the Poles, and talked to Lech Wałęsa, and started looking through the underground materials. So I started getting my hands on duplicator machines, all the stuff that ended up. So I got to the point where I had a pretty reasonable story, but there was stuff missing. And I think at that point, then I got help with interviews. So I interviewed people both before the Reagan administration, like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who recently passed away. He was the National Security Advisor for Carter, but as he said to me, spoke regularly with President Reagan about this particular issue. The Casey Archives in Hoover at Stanford I went to, and there's a little bit starting to come out in the former CIA director's archives, and then a range of people who I noted in the book that worked on covert action. And then I had the history office at CIA sent the copy of the manuscript, and they provided a bunch of comments. So there was help from talking to people. There was help from archives. The Poles were quite helpful in piecing some of this together. And I think what you get is some corrections to what we knew in the past. There were some estimates that the CIA was giving $100+ million. The figures look like they're closer to about 20 million, which is still reasonably large, but there were some initial indications that CIA was basing this out of the Warsaw Station, maybe even in Germany. We get a lot more fidelity on the kinds of places and the rat lines that were used to move information. So there are a range of things that are, I think, corrected. I think what's probably still missing, and as we get more information's declassified, more of the puzzle pieces will come together. So I would say there's a lot more we now know because of this. There's still more and more details that probably for the moment you don't want out there, because there are people's names that I found, including their real names, that are still alive, that Poles that were supportive, that were assets. And I use pseudonyms in the book instead of noting them. So, at some point, 10 to 15, 20 years, particularly after people pass away, there may be more rationale for getting even more granular on what we know. So I think this advances the ball, but there are still some sensitivities to a program that's still, 40 years, 30 to 40 years old.
You took a picture there. You said
Wait.
All right.
We gotta get it for the YouTube video.
Thank you. You took a picture there. You displayed it. You said that was a picture you had taken of the printing presses?
Yes, this was my picture of printing presses that the Solidarity Museum in Gdansk
Okay.
had put together.
All right, that was my question.
Yeah.
One more, please.
This one.
At the time this was going on, can we assume that there were parallel programs going on in some of the other satellite countries that may or may not have been as successful as this one?
Well, interestingly, there's been a little bit more information. One of them that's come out recently is a broader program. It's called the book program. And that's a little bit of this started to come out. The CIA funded books that were being moved from bookstores in places like London into Eastern Europe, and including into the Soviet Union itself, as part of a broader effort to get books, journals, poetry that was prohibited in the Soviet Union or in Warsaw Pact countries into those countries. That was also a covert action program. That is now partially declassified. So Reich's book is among the best hot books in the Cold War, which was another program. There were also some efforts, a program to support, it's a small one that was to support a Polish journal called Kultura that had existed prior to the one I'm looking at here. So there had been a number of things going on at the same time in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Poland is probably because there was an opportunity there, and a labor union of 10 million plus was the most successful program, because you had an active opposition that was really well organized and willing to stand up. And the Polish government was very cautious about how much it was going to crack down. Even in the few years after martial law in December of 1981, the Jaruzelski government was still somewhat cautious about how much to actually crack down. And I think this is interestingly why the Soviet Union probably never invaded. You can see a lot of the declassified information. They were very worried about putting Red Army forces in Poland because of what would potentially turn into an active armed opposition if they put Red Army forces there. So I think, yes, there were other programs, including the book program. The fact that it was so successful in Poland was probably a result of specific aspects of the Polish people, the opposition movement, and its organization, and then its charismatic people like Wałęsa.
You mentioned Gary Cooper being used. When I was in Poland, especially in the the Southwest, they used John Wayne. There was a lot of posters, and I didn't even know these people would know who John Wayne or Gary Cooper would be. And nobody seemed to know why they would use John Wayne to get people out to vote. Did you have any thoughts on?
What seems to be pretty clear is that the Poles watched American television or movies quite extensively. And, one of the things that Reagan did pretty well is he encouraged the U.S. Information Agency to push out television programs in support of the Polish people. He went on television multiple times, including in December of 1981. But his speeches at Westminster, talking about the Soviet Union and arguing that it was going to be put in the ash bin of history. I mean, these were all aspects, I think, of what drew the Poles to the U.S. as they were by far the strongest outside supporters in the darkest days. So, the smuggling efforts that went in addition to supporting Solidarity, also included video cassettes of movies. One of the most poignant parts of sitting in the Reagan Library was, you could tell it was a very emotional President Reagan, where he's getting a series of letters from Solidarity members in prison. And they're essentially saying to him, please keep this up. You probably do not understand what kind of impact you're having on us. We all pass around, every time you speak publicly, we listen. We pass it around, whether it's audio, video, or transcripts of what you say. You are our light. You keep us, Poles on the anniversary of martial law would light a candle in the window, and Reagan encouraged everybody in the U.S. to light candles. That, I think, encourage, I mean, plus U.S. also has strong Polish immigrant populations here. But I think that, you go into some of the oddest places if you go into some of the churches in Gdansk, there are pictures of Reagan inside of the church, George H.W. Bush, who was Reagan's vice president, inside of these churches right now. It's left a startling image. And so I think all of these things together help explain why these images ended up being so significant along these lines.
This question goes back a little further in time. After Stalin died and Khrushchev gave his secret speech, wasn't there a sense generally in Eastern Europe that communism was just running out of gas, and that Reagan's election and the Pope's accession provided the spark to get movements like this going?
I think that certainly helped, but I think you have to remember that everybody, even in the early 80s and late 70s, they recognized what had happened in Czechoslovakia. So there was this aura of Red Army tanks that could be deployed as they were in 1968, and that they could crush opposition or try to crush opposition movements. And what's interesting is when you go back to the debates that were happening in the Reagan White House in 1982, one of the strongest concerns among Richard Pipes, who was the senior director of the National Security Council, recently died, but I spent a lot of time with Pipes. He was deeply involved in this program, died earlier this year. What he said to me was, one of the things that we had to be very careful about is to set limited objectives. What we didn't want to do is tell Solidarity directly or indirectly that we were supporting an overthrow of the Polish government, because what we were worried about is if we went that far, that they would be crushed either by the Soviets or by the Jaruzelski regime, and we were not about to get involved in any major way in an insurgency, armed insurgency, and providing weapons into Poland. So I think there were concerns in the late 70s, and there had been a couple of periods where the Polish regime had cracked down on early demonstrations. If you go visit Gdansk today, just outside of gate number 2, there's a monument to those workers that have been killed in opposition demonstrations. So it was not, in my view, a foregone conclusion, at least by the early 80s, that this was going to succeed. It began to appear with a Polish Pope, with a U.S. president that was willing to go on the offensive, especially on the information side, that there were vulnerabilities in the system. And obviously, as we got to 85 and 86, and Gorbachev's decision to open up society, glasnost, perestroika, the cracks started to widen. And then after Poland, it was Germany and Czechoslovakia and other countries. So, but I think the aura of 1968 still continued to hang around Poland even during those early years.
I just want to express my gratitude as a retired CIA person. I spent about a third of my career on the history staff. It was before, or I think it was, I retired before you were involved with them. We knew the story. We knew it was a great story. We just couldn't talk about it openly. So I think you've done a great service to historical truth. Thank you.
The timing is interesting. That was not intentional. It was not intentional in the face of some Russian active measures today, nor in the need for combating information. None of that was intentional, but it was. It turns out to be not just a good story, but there are debates about the Afghan program, and I spent a lot of time in the U.S. government in Afghanistan. When you provide weapons, including Stinger missiles, to an opposition group, there are some risks and costs. I think in the end, getting the Soviets out of Afghanistan was important. But there are costs and risks to a paramilitary program. There were none of those costs and risks, and this was supporting a legitimate opposition movement. So thank you very much for what you've done. And, you know, this is just highlighting, I think, what is a really interesting case.
Well, I think that everyone needs to buy the book, which is sale in the back of the room, and get you to sign it. And if they have another question, maybe ask in the back, because it's almost 1 o'clock. So thank you so much.
Thank you.